Archon Vorax stood in the spire of consensus, his secondary hearts beating in a synchronous, clinical rhythm. Below him, the zenith nexus stretched out like a sprawling web of obsidian and light, a monument to 10,000 years of xylary hegemony. On his primary data lens, the integration protocol glowed with a soft, bioluminescent amber. It was more than a legal document. It was a masterpiece of biological and political entrapment. The Terrans called it a treaty, but Vorax knew better. It was a digestive process. The xylary did not conquer through crude bombardment or orbital fire. They absorbed. They took the strongest stock of a primitive world and grafted it into the Imperial chitin, turning potential rivals into permanent servants. Terra Nova was the latest anomaly, a small, water-heavy world filled with short-lived bipeds who seemed to survive on a diet of adrenaline and improbable luck. The matriarch overlord had been clear. The Terrans were too volatile to be left as neighbors, but too resilient to be wasted as ash. The Edict of Binding was the solution. By absorbing their most decorated survivor into the royal line, the xylary would effectively decapitate the Terran spirit. Vorax adjusted his ceremonial mantle, the living chitin of his suit shifting to accommodate his movement. He had drafted the legal loopholes himself, ensuring the Terran representative would arrive as a guest and remain as a specimen. Would you accept a hand of friendship if you knew the fingers were made of iron? Would you walk into the light if you knew the shadows were waiting to claim your name? Kalen Voss stepped off the transport shuttle, the atmospheric seal hissing behind him. The air in the Zenith Nexus tasted of ozone and expensive filtration, a sharp contrast to the recycled, metallic scent of the Terran cruisers. He was smaller than the xylary guards flanking him, his shoulders narrow compared to their broad, insectoid carapaces. He wore a simple tactical uniform, devoid of medals, though the scars on his knuckles spoke of a history no ribbon could capture. In his left hand, he gripped a rugged, battered data slate. It looked like a relic, a primitive slab of glass and silicon that had no place in a station built from nanotech and living crystal. A sharp crack echoed through the docking bay. Then the hum of the dampening field stabilized. Kalen didn't flinch. He didn't look at the towering spires or the thousands of xylary citizens gathered in the observation tiers to witness the primitive, who was to be their newest royal consort. He simply adjusted his grip on the slate, his thumb leaving a persistent, oily smudge of condensation on the corner of the screen. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent 48 hours reading fine print in a room without windows. Archon Vorax watched the arrival through the station's high-resolution sensor feed. The Terran's heart rate was dangerously low for a species facing extinction. There was no surge of cortisol, no dilated pupils, none of the typical mammalian fear responses Vorax had cataloged during the initial conquest of the outer colonies, which meant the integration protocol was a gilded cage, not a treaty. Vorax tapped his stylus against his mandibles. He began reviewing the soldier's dossier for the 100th time. Kalen Voss, specialist, sole survivor of the siege of Vesta. He had lived through a vacuum exposure that should have boiled his blood. He had walked across a salt flat with a shattered femur to deliver a targeting beacon. The xylary appreciated resilience, but they misread it as a biological trait. They saw it as something to be harvested and sequenced. Vorax, however, noticed the way the humans' eyes didn't track the guards. They tracked the security cameras. They tracked the structural supports of the docking ring. The Archon felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite anxiety, but closer to the biological warning of a predator noticing a trap. He pushed the thought aside. The hegemony was built on the Valk Declaration, a rigid legal code that had never been successfully challenged by a lesser species. The human was here to sign his world away. Kalen walked toward the central lift, his boots clicking rhythmically against the obsidian floor. The xylary crowds made a sound like dry leaves skittering in a wind, a collective chittering of amusement and condescension. To them, he was a curiosity, a pet. Kalen stopped at the base of the lift and looked up, staring directly into the primary sensor eye of the station. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He just leaned his weight onto his right leg, his thumb still rubbing that oily spot on the data slate. Inside the spire, Vorax received a transmission from the docking crew. The human had refused the ceremonial nutrient bath. He had complained of indigestion and requested a standard Terran caffeine ration. It was a trivial request, a sign of biological weakness that the crew had laughed at. But Vorax watched the way Kalen's thumb moved. It wasn't a nervous twitch. It was a rhythmic, deliberate motion. Pattern recognition machines. The Xylari used them to predict weather, markets, and orbital mechanics. Vorax realized, with a sudden chill in his secondary hearts, that the human was doing the same thing manually. He wasn't looking at the Zenith Nexus as a palace. He was looking at it as a system. The slate in his hand wasn't a toy. It was a calculator. And the indigestion wasn't a stomach ache. It was the physical manifestation of a species that found the current reality difficult to swallow. Kalen Voss entered the lift. The doors hissed shut, cutting off the chittering of the crowd. Spite. It was a word Vorax had found in the Terran dictionaries during his research. It didn't have a direct translation in Xylari. To the hegemony, you either obeyed or you were recycled. There was no room for doing something simply to deny another's victory. But as the lift ascended toward the spire of consensus, Vorax saw the human's reflection in the polished metal doors. Kalen wasn't praying. He wasn't preparing a speech. He was checking the encryption headers on his primitive slate, his face as cold and unyielding as the vacuum he had survived. Beneath the observation deck, something shifted. The abyssal gauntlet was waking up, its gravity coils humming with enough power to flatten a skyscraper. Archon Vorax watched from the high balcony, his fingers interlacing behind his back. The rhythmic, metallic ticking of a thermal expansion joint in the gallery's support structure was the only sound in the sudden silence of the spire. It felt like a clock. It felt like the heartbeat of the Empire itself, waiting for the inevitable surrender of the small, scarred man standing in the center of the arena. Vorax looked down at the human. Kalen Voss did not look like a conqueror. He looked like a man standing in a storm, his simple uniform fluttering in the artificial wind generated by the cooling vents of the pit. Kalen Voss looked up at the High Council. He didn't ask for mercy. He didn't look at the weapons. He looked at his data slate, the oily smudge on the screen now wiped clean by a sleeve, revealing a complex lattice of Terran code and Xylari legal scripts. He was tapping the glass in a precise, 3-beat rhythm that matched the ticking in the wall. Commenced the integration. The command from the matriarch echoed through the chamber, and the floor of the pit dissolved into a shimmering field of biokinetic pressure. This was the first stage of the gauntlet, a sensory and physical onslaught designed to break the nervous system of any non-Xylari life form. The pressure was intense, a localized gravity well that sought to pull the marrow from Kalen's bones, which meant the readings were wrong. Kalen's slate flared with a harsh, blue light. He wasn't fighting the gravity. He was feeding data into the station's own feedback loop. Vorax leaned over the railing, his mandibles twitching in confusion. The human should have been on his knees. Instead, Kalen was bracing himself against the air, his muscles corded like steel cables, his breathing a ragged, rhythmic growl that refused to surrender to the crushing weight. As the gravity wells of the abyssal gauntlet began to cycle through their lethal harmonic frequencies, creating a shimmering field of distorted light and crushing pressure that would have liquefied the internal organs of any species less stubborn than a Terran, Kalen Voss simply tightened his grip on the slate and looked for the gap in the code. I invoke the Valk Declaration. Kalen's voice was a rasp, projected through the station's own intercom system. Section 9. Status, Sovereign Contributor. The arena fell into a silence so absolute it felt physical. Vorax felt his secondary heart stutter. Section 9 was a ghost in the machine, a relic of the old hegemony that had not been whispered in 3 centuries. It was the indigestion Kalen had brought with him, a legal poison hidden in a primitive bottle. The Xylari pride was their undoing. They had spent decades silently harvesting Terran synthetic protein sequences to stabilize their own living chitin armor, believing the primitives would never notice the theft. They had integrated Terran biology into the very fabric of the hegemony's survival. Kalen had the logs. He had the sequences. He had the proof that the Xylari hegemony was already biologically dependent on Terra Nova. According to the Valk Declaration, any species that provided foundational biological stability to the Empire was exempt from absorption. They were partners, not subjects. They were the species that does not break because they are already part of the Foundation. The gravity wells flickered and died. He stood. Kalen Voss remained at the center of the pit, his chest heaving, blood trickling from a ruptured capillary in his eye, but his head held high. He looked at Vorax, and for the first time, the Archon saw not a specimen, but a peer. The primitive data slate was no longer a toy. It was the weapon that had just decapitated an empire's legal right to conquest. 12 years later, the Zenith Nexus looked different. The obsidian was still there, but it was tempered by the warmth of Terran architectural influence, and the chittering of the crowds was now a hum of collaborative industry. Archon Vorax sat at a long table of living crystal, a cup of standard Terran caffeine steaming before him. Beside him sat Kalen Voss, his hair graying at the temples, his eyes still tracking the room with the same predatory precision he had used to dismantle a god. They were no longer master and specimen. They were the architects of a messy, complicated, and remarkably resilient piece. Vorax watched Kalen's hand rest on the table, the human's fingers still tapping that same 3-beat rhythm. On the wall behind them, encased in a field of protective stasis, hung a battered, cracked data slate with an oily smudge on the corner of the glass. A single, weathered data slate resting on a table of living crystal.